Okay, well, we got 16 people here, and so I'm just going to start talking. More people may come in as we go along, but I want to give just an introduction first. So welcome everyone to our first Science and Faith talk to be broadcast live on Zoom. I'm Brother John, and I'm at St. Dominic's Church here in Los Angeles in Eagle Rock. And I'm really happy that you're all here for what I'm sure will be an insightful talk about the relation between psychology and religion. I heard Dr. Muñoz give a talk at Notre Dame when I was back there in November, and it was excellent. It was absolutely excellent. That's why I invited her to come and speak to our parish. First, I have a couple logistical details. As you all noticed, I'm sure you're mute. And you've been automatically muted because we're going to have at least 16 right now. More people may be coming in. So it just makes it much more efficient, and it's much clearer if everybody's on mute during her presentation. And you can't unmute yourselves. Don't try. Don't worry about it. Second, this is really important. When it comes to questions, please type any question you have at any point during Dr. Muñoz's presentation in the chat window. There's a little chat window you can bring up. I can see anything that anybody says in there. You can chat with other people. But if you have any question at any point during the presentation, just type it in the chat window, because that's how I'm going to determine how the Q&A session goes at the end of the presentation. I'll look at the question, I'll unmute that person, introduce them, and then they can ask their question to Dr. Jennifer and have a little conversation with her about whatever question you may have. So that's the most important logistical part of how the Q&A will work. Okay, so now I'm proud to introduce today's speaker to all of you. Dr. Jennifer C. Muñoz earned her doctorate in clinical psychology from the Institute for the Psychological Sciences, which is this program out on the East Coast that aims to integrate the science of psychology with the Catholic Church's vision of the human person. She's happily married and living in South Bend, Indiana, and she is a homeschooling mother of 3 before it became necessary because of the virus. So she was a professional before everybody got forced into this. So, broadcasting live from the De Nicolas Center for Ethics and Culture at the University of Notre Dame, I am now proud to present to you Dr. Jennifer C. Muñoz.
Thank you very much, Brother John. And thanks to everybody who's watching from home. I know that everybody has more important or more enjoyable things to do 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. So if you're watching this live, I hope you have terrible weather so you're not really missing a beautiful day to hear this talk. But hopefully I'll give you something to make it a little bit worthwhile. And thank you, Brother John, for inviting me to be part of the lecture series. And especially thank you for changing the time. So 2 o'clock is not great for you all, but 10 o'clock at night was really not good for me since I'm 3 hours ahead. So I'm going to be a lot more coherent than I would otherwise. And I appreciate also, I want to give my thanks again to the De Nicolas Center for Ethics and Culture, because if it weren't for them and their equipment and their rooms, we would be doing this in my bedroom and my kids would be running in and wanting to talk to Grandpa, and you all know how that goes. So, all right, so as Brother John said, I'm going to be talking about the compatibility between the science of psychology and the faith. But I'm going to go a step beyond compatibility in the sense of the lack of conflict. And the argument I'm going to make is that psychology and the faith, so far from being incompatible, they actually need each other to do their own jobs well. So we'll talk more about that. And let me just say before I get started, I'm especially happy to have the chance to talk about psychology in a Catholic context, because I think it often happens that very devout Catholics tend to be a bit wary of psychology, and I think with very good reason. So I'm going to be giving some limitations of psychology, and the takeaway from that part may be the sense that, well, what is psychology good for? And hopefully I'm going to get a chance to address that in the second part of the talk. So you can define psychology, broadly speaking, as the scientific study of human experience. So what does that mean? It's the study of thoughts, emotions, motivations, behaviors, relationships, and so on. Now, if you've been following this series, as other more serious scientists than myself have been talking about the relationship between science and the faith, you've been hearing things about the scientific method, I'm sure. And with psychology, that raises some red flags? How can you apply the scientific method to things that you can't see or measure? Because a scientific method, it requires the ability to directly observe and quantify the things that you want to study. So how do you do that in psychology? Well, you can't directly study somebody's emotions or their thoughts or their motivations. So you have to come up with correlates, things that you think reflect what's going on inside the person, and measure that. Well, that means that you might be studying people's self-report of how they're feeling. You might be tracking things you can see like behavior, even things like eye movement. Those all get incorporated into psychological studies. Okay, so what's the problem there? Well, the problem is you get all this data about, okay, well, I saw this behavior and this behavior, or I saw this eye movement. But what does it mean? When a psychologist finishes a study and they look at the data they get, they have to take that data and interpret it. And this is where psychology has a weakness, as I think is true of other sciences as well. How that data gets interpreted requires a particular philosophical framework. But a lot of times, scientists are not aware of that fact. They're not always fully aware of their own psychological framework. So you can see how this can go awry. All right, let me give you an example. I saw a headline a couple of years ago. I didn't bother to read the article, but the headline said, new psychological study proves that different parenting styles don't matter. They don't make any difference. So my immediate question is, well, they don't make a difference for what? What is the thing that you're claiming the psychological parenting style makes no difference? So, if I'm going to set up a study about that, I might measure what? SAT scores, how high paying a job the person has as an adult, you might look at those. Or if you have a very different outlook on what makes for a healthy, well-rounded adult, you might measure something like their capacity for deep relationships. So how you set up your study depends on, in this case, what you think creates a well-rounded adult. And that is going to depend on what you think leads to a good life. In order to be a healthy, functioning adult, what do you need? What's important that we're going to consider in the study? So you can see how you have to have a philosophical framework. Well, psychologists are not philosophers. And if you don't have training in philosophy to catch these errors in philosophical thought that you're making, you can make mistakes. So an example of mistakes in the philosophical side of psychology. I imagine many of you could give me some examples, but here's a few. Okay, the idea that people are just a bundle of unconscious primal urges, warring with a neurotic guilt over their expression. That's Freud's psychoanalytic theory, right? People's behavior is the result only of trained responses to stimuli. That's behaviorism. People's behaviors, impulses, and appetites, and everything that's part of human nature is just a result of evolution, and it's aimed only at the preservation of the species. That's evolutionary psychology. So you're probably familiar with some of these things. These are all reductionist philosophies. Okay? The idea that something that is true of one part of the human being can be used to explain the whole. That the whole is nothing more than, not even the sum of its parts, the whole is nothing more than some of its parts. So in these cases, all of these errors could be really nicely addressed by St. Thomas's Treatise on Man, how the soul and the body are integrated so that, yes, we do have unconscious impulses, we do have neurochemicals that affect behavior, but we are more than that. All right, so that's the first place where psychology needs the help of faith. This philosophical framework to help psychology understand the meaning of what it's observing. Its behaviors, its observations are important, but what those mean is a further step that requires good philosophy. Okay, so the second problematic area, this is an area of weakness for purely secular psychology, is what psychologists believe makes for emotional health and happiness. there has been a very common view among many schools of psychology, not all, but many schools of psychology, that health requires accepting all of our impulses very uncritically. And in fact, that self-denial or self-control can be unhealthy. So in this view of human nature, the only limit to your ability to choose your own reality and choose to embrace your impulses essentially is not harming other people. And by not harming other people, as far as they've gotten, is this idea that you're not violating consent, right? That's a very common view among psychologists. The problem, of course, is that selfishness and perversion, we know, doesn't actually lead to happiness. And leading people to happiness is the explicit goal of psychotherapy. So in order for psychotherapy to do its job well, it needs the moral compass provided by the faith to be able to say, this will make you happy. You think that this will make you happy, but it really won't. So without that idea of objective truth in terms of the way our human nature is constructed, you can lead people pretty far astray. And finally, the last thing I'm going to touch on is psychology will never have an answer to the gnawing ache that we feel in ourselves for something that is more than what exists in this world. We are made for God. That is a yearning that cannot be filled by anything at a human level. And as Catholics, we know this. But psychology doesn't know this. And so unintentionally, psychologists can lead clients on a kind of rabbit trail of distractions, of more self-discovery, more involvement in creative activities and so on, as a way to distract themselves from this gnawing ache, this yearning for something else, which we know is the yearning for God. So that's quickly the last way I would say that psychology really needs the full vision of what the human person is that's provided by the faith. And Gaudium et Spes, one of the foundational documents of Vatican II, refers to this, I think, when it says, Christ reveals man to himself, that we can't understand human nature in their totality, and if we are looking at human beings apart from our end in God. Okay, that's all I want to say right now about how psychology needs the faith. Like I said, I feel like that side of things is probably more immediately obvious, especially to devout Christians. And I think it's also less interesting than what I want to get to in the second part of my talk. So I just also want to say, I think these limitations they're going to be inherent in any purely secular field. It's not a sign that psychology has nothing of value to offer. It's simply the limitations that come with an incomplete vision of the subject matter you're studying. Psychology does a tremendous amount of good, and it has uncovered a wealth of information and a subtlety of understanding of human behavior, which is very, very valuable. And of course, not all psychological theories go so badly off track as reductionist theories do. In fact, there are some theories that we would actually see as being really compatible with a Christian view of the human person. I also, at this point, want to pause and say, I've talked about the limitations of psychotherapy, and now I want to talk about the benefits of psychotherapy. A skilled therapist who has a proper vision of the human person can do an amazing amount of good. Psychotherapy does work. For all of its limitations that I've just referred to, it does work. So I just want to take a moment. I'm going to show you a slide that I have. One of the most common questions I'm asked as a Catholic psychologist is, how do I find a good Catholic therapist in my area? So I'm just going to make a real quick plug. I'm going to show you the slide here, see if I can get this up. Okay, so here's what I tell people. If you're looking for a Catholic therapist, there is a website called catholictherapist.com. It is not a listing of every Catholic therapist in your area, but it's a good place to start. And if you find people in your state, but they're not close to you, you may want to give them a call and see if they have people they can recommend to you closer by. But that's a wonderful resource. I also recommend people talk to their diocesan office, because they will generally have a list of Catholic therapists in their area that they give out to their priests when the priest wants to refer somebody for counseling. So that can be a really good resource. And finally, if you're interested in therapy and you're not having luck finding a good Catholic one, just go to the website of the therapists you do find in your area. More and more therapists are keeping very detailed websites that go through their own philosophical approaches to counseling, and you can get a pretty good sense of what you're working with there. So, if you see somebody who specializes in transgendered therapy, you get some idea of what you're working with. Okay, so let me close that now. All right, I'm going to now switch gears and talk in the other direction. And I feel like this is the more interesting part of the talk, so I wanted to save most of the time for this. Like I said, I think most devout Catholics are aware of where they need to be cautious of psychology, but I don't think that they're quite as aware of the benefits of it. And I want to argue that it's not only beneficial, it's critical for our spiritual lives that we have a kind of psychological sensitivity to ourselves and to people around us. So I said at the beginning of the talk, I was going to say how both science and psychology need each other to do their job well. Well, obviously Jesus doesn't need Freud to save souls, so we're clear on that. What I do mean is that the church's job is working with souls and leading souls to heaven. And Pope Francis talks a great deal about accompaniment. You cannot accompany people if you can't understand where they are, if you can't understand their sorrows and their struggles and their sufferings. So the church needs that psychological sensitivity, and we need that kind of awareness of those psychological dynamics in ourselves, because I argue that we cannot make progress in the spiritual life if we don't understand ourselves. So I often hear from devout Christians who say, I don't need therapy. I'm feeling anxious, but that's just a sign that I don't trust God enough. I simply need to pray more. If I prayed more and I trusted God more, this anxiety I'm feeling would go away. And I do understand that approach. And of course, there's truth to it. But there's a little bit of a danger in that. So I'm going to say something that I think is a little bit shocking, but I stand by it. I think that we, as Christians, we are at risk of over-spiritualizing our spiritual life. So we over-spiritualize our relationship with God. And this is what I mean by that. There's a tendency that we all have, to give a spiritual explanation for everything we experience in our spiritual life. So again, I gave the example of somebody who's anxious. They say, well, I just need to work on trusting God more. If I don't feel God's presence or his consolation, well, I'm being tested. It's a dark night of the soul or a dark night of the senses. And there's truth to that. That could be it. But we tend to forget that there's more going on than just God's action in our souls when it comes to the spiritual life. So I was a member of the Nashville Dominicans for a year as a postulant. And I loved it. I was wonderfully happy there. But I went through this period where suddenly everything was just incredibly difficult. And I would go into the chapel and I would kneel down, and I just felt the most profound aversion towards prayer. And I went to my novice mistress and I said, I don't think I've got a vocation because this is so hard. I hate prayer right now. And she said, okay, well, we can talk about that. But before we go there, how much sleep are you getting? How many cups of coffee a day are you drinking? What about your sugar intake? How much exercise are you getting? She said, let's get those things under control and then come back and talk to me. And she was right. I took care of my body and those feelings of aversion towards prayer disappeared. Not to say everything is mediated by our body, but some things are, and I think we tend to forget that. And in the same way that our spiritual life can be affected by what's going on in our bodies, even more so can it be affected by what's going on in our souls. I think we tend to forget that our souls are human. And that means that even in a relationship with God, it is in a sense a human relationship because I am human. I don't have two ways of being in relationship with people. I have the human way because I am human. So we need to be aware that the dynamics that we experience in our human relationships absolutely affect our relationship with God. I think at this point, there's a lot of different ways I could go. I could give a sort of broad spectrum explanation of all the different ways that a psychological sensitivity and awareness can help the spiritual life. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mention something that's helpful as an aside, and then go in more deeply into what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about. So there's many different lenses through which you can think about your own personal psychology and psychological makeup. One of them that's very helpful is the temperaments. Probably everybody's familiar with the concept of the 4 temperaments. It's not a rigorous scientific concept, so it's not like a clinical diagnosis, but it's something I think a lot of people are familiar with. And there are lots of resources out there on how your temperament affects your spiritual life, how your own inclinations and proclivities and sensitivities affect the way you interact with God. I had a booklet that I think was published probably 20, 30 years ago that was called Prayer and the 4 Temperaments. I did a Google search before this talk. I couldn't find it, but there are a whole bunch of other resources that pop up. So if you type in temperaments and prayer, you get this huge list of resources. Well, another one that I do know does still exist is an excellent book by Professor Art Bennett called The Temperament God Gave You. He goes through and he outlines the 4 different temperaments, characteristics of each, and how they affect our prayer life. And I think he even gives recommendations on different types of prayer for each temperament. So I do recommend looking into that. I think that can be very helpful. But as I said, that's just one lens. There's lots of different lenses. I'm going to focus more on the lens that I'm most familiar with through my research, which is attachment theory. This comes out of my doctoral research on the experience of leaving religious life. I had noticed that some people, when they leave religious life, just suffer tremendously. Pain that lasts, in some cases, for a decade or more. And people were unable to explain why this was happening to them when so-and-so who they knew left religious life did just fine. And my theory was that it's the individual differences in personalities and so-called attachment style, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. But rather than focus on leaving religious life, that's only applicable to a few. I'm going to back up and just talk about how our attachment styles broadly affect our relationship with God. And I'm going to look particularly in the situation of great struggle in the spiritual life. And when I say great struggle, what I'm talking about are those times when you experience something tremendously painful, the death of a loved one, the experience of evil, unanswered prayers, and it causes you to doubt what God is doing in your life. I call that a time of ambiguity, because what God is doing in your life at that point is unclear. It's sort of open for your interpretation. I'm going to give you an example from my own life to talk about the kind of struggle and suffering I mean. So, Brother John mentioned I have 3 children, but I've actually been pregnant 9 times. 6 of my pregnancies ended in miscarriage. And if anybody is watching who's been through a miscarriage, you know it's tremendously painful. When I want to talk about my 4th miscarriage, The first 3 babies that we lost were gone before we knew about it. But the 4th one, I went for the ultrasound appointment, and the baby was alive, but the doctor said, I give it about a 50-50 chance of survival. So we went back and we did what you would expect. We just started praying nonstop. And we asked everybody we knew to pray for us. I tell people, we had people on all sides, all places in the country. We had 3 convents and the entire Dominican House of Studies praying for this baby. And of course, as you figure, the baby died. And so I was dealing with this great grief, but I was also dealing with a really profound struggle in my relationship with God, because I prayed for this baby's life. And I knew that what I was asking for was good. Like, I understand sometimes God doesn't give us the things we ask for because they're not good, but how is my baby's life not a good thing? And I prayed diligently. And even if God didn't love me enough to answer my prayer, that we had 500 other people praying, did he not love them enough to answer their prayers for this baby's life? I was angry at God for at least 2 years. I mean, to the point where I had to take it to confession. And I said, Father, I have to say, I don't believe that God cares about us, and I don't believe he answers our prayers. I think he does what he wants to do, and we can pray as much as we want, but it doesn't matter. That's what I'm talking about when I'm describing periods of ambiguity, and in the context of deep suffering. I feel like God has abandoned me or rejected me, and to not feel that way is a real struggle. Okay, so we all have experiences like that in our lives. And it occurred to me as I was getting ready for this talk, some people may be going through this right now with the coronavirus. I mean, God forbid any of you has lost a loved one, but this may be something that's front and center in your life right now. So we all experience times like this. But some people, I think, because of their attachment style, will experience it more as rejection by God than others do, and that leads to a greater pain, greater suffering. All right, so let's talk about attachment theory so you'll understand what I'm referring to. So attachment theory was developed by John Bowlby. He did his research in the 1950s and 60s, and there's been a huge amount of research since then supporting it as a very, very solid theoretical model. I love it, and it's beautifully congruent with the Christian view of the human person as being profoundly relational, because it focuses on relationships. The theory states generally that the way your parents interact with you from the time that you're a baby, you begin to develop these expectations about how they're going to treat you. I generally expect my parents to be loving and supportive. Or perhaps I expect them to be generally distant and cold. Or I may even experience a sort of strange back and forth between the two. Now, children do this. They take everything personally. And this is, for those of you that have kids, you know how hard this makes parenting. Everything that you do, the children take personally. So if you treat them harshly, the child may say to themselves, I don't feel loved. It must be because I'm not lovable. We take this experience of how people treat us and we turn it into an assessment of our own worth. And we do it without thinking about it. So for many people, this is a real wound that begins in childhood. Well, what happens is, as we grow up with these experiences and these expectations, we begin to expect this kind of treatment from our relationships in general. It's not just my parents, it's going to be everybody that I have a close, intimate relationship will treat me in the same way. So now you begin to have not just expectations about yourself and your own worth, you start to have expectations about people in general and relationships in general. So if you take those two axes, the view of self and the view of other people, what you get is a chart that gives you 4 quadrants. I'm going to try to pull up this slide again. I'll see if I can do this. I'm shutting down my screen. Okay, there we go. Everybody see that? Okay. So you can see the horizontal axis there is the view of self. You've got positive self over here on the left side, negative view of self on the right. This vertical axis is the view of others. You've got positive up here, negative down here. So you get these 4 quadrants. I'm going to talk briefly about each of the 4. So the securely attached person is up here in this upper left quadrant. They have a positive view of themselves and a positive view of other people. And what that means is they enjoy close relationships. They're not afraid of intimacy. And they're not particularly afraid of being rejected because they view themselves as being lovable. Not to say they're arrogant, but they're not panicked about being rejected. Now, as I go through each one of these, I'm going to give you a scenario and show you how it would play out for the different attachment styles so you kind of get a better sense of what I mean. All right, so let's assume you get a text. Let's just use the modern format here. You get a text from someone you're dating, and they say something very ambiguous, something like, I'm not sure how I feel about our relationship right now. And it's very ambiguous. It could mean they're about to break up with you. It could mean that they want to get married and they're tired of you dragging your feet. So, but it's really not clear. And it's the kind of thing that I think most of us would feel pretty anxious about. Okay, the securely attached person would feel uncomfortable with this, but they're not immediately going to assume that they're going to be rejected. In fact, they may even be able to see how it could mean something positive. You know, maybe they want to move forward in our relationship. So their response is, okay, let's talk about it. Let's get together. Let's see what your thinking is, and I'll sit with this, and I'm not too anxious about it. Okay, that's obviously not the case with all the different attachment styles now. So let's go back to our grid. Let's talk about this quadrant up here, upper right. The preoccupied style has a positive view of others, so they want intimate relationships. They enjoy that closeness with others. But they have a negative view of themselves. So they don't really believe deep down that they are lovable. And that means that they do kind of expect to get rejected. At some point, my significant other is going to realize that I've been faking it all along, and they're going to be disillusioned with me, and the relationship is going to end. So what happens is this creates a lot of anxiety, and the person becomes hyper-vigilant for signs that they're about to be rejected. So they get the text message that says, I'm not sure how I feel about our relationship right now. And they immediately text back, what's wrong? What did I do? Talk to me. What did I do? What's wrong? And they'll send up another text 2 minutes later. Why haven't you responded to me yet? Why are you ignoring me? What's wrong? What's wrong? And they continue with this sort of tightly clinging, anxious behavior. Maybe it even escalates to the point where they're accusing the other person of cheating on them. There's a great deal of anger now that goes along with this anxiety. All right. Let's talk about this quadrant now. Lower right, the fearful attachment style. They have a negative view of themselves. Like the preoccupied style, they don't think deep down that they're lovable. They're afraid that they're not. They sort of expect rejection. But unlike the preoccupied style, they have a negative view of others, which means they're uncomfortable with too much intimacy in their relationships. Whereas the preoccupied type clings very tightly to intimate relationships. The fearful type keeps everybody at arm's length. And that's because they're afraid of being rejected. And being emotionally vulnerable is too scary for them. So they have this very arm's length facade of invulnerability. So the fearfully attached person gets the text, not sure how I feel about our relationship. It's like flipping a switch, just like with the preoccupied style. That anxiety kicks in, they become overwhelmed. But their way of dealing with it, like I said, is distancing. So they just slam the door on the relationship. Their response to the text is something like, you know, I'm so glad you brought that up because I've been feeling that way too. And in fact, I think we need to take a break. In fact, I just think we need to break up. So I'm so convinced that you are going to reject me that I'm going to reject you first because then I can still feel invulnerable. You haven't hurt me. Of course, they are afraid of being rejected. And so their ability to shut the door on those emotions, they succeed some of the time, but some of the time your emotions are too strong. They're going to pop up, feel overwhelmed. They're going to try to push them down again. And there's this sort of oscillating struggle that they go through in dealing with those emotions. Okay, last time we'll go back to this chart here. The dismissing type. So lower left quadrant. They have a positive view of themselves. They think that they're perfectly lovable, but they have a negative view of other people, which means they don't feel comfortable with intimate relationships. The dismissing type generally feels like, I'm not afraid of relationships, I just don't need them. Now, we're not really going to talk that much about this type because a couple of reasons. It's the least well understood in the literature. There's some contradictory findings. What I think, and what other theorists have said, is that this type starts out in childhood as the fearful type, because the dismissing type doesn't actually exist among children. They probably start out as children with the fearful type, but they become so good at convincing themselves that they don't need other people that they stop being aware of their desire for relationships altogether. It's the least common in the population, so we'll set that one aside. If anybody wants to talk about it later, I'm happy to go into it more. Okay, so I've been talking about ambiguous situations all this time, and I think you can probably see where I'm going with this. When we have a situation in our spiritual life where it's deeply ambiguous what God is doing, and there's a great deal of pain there, depending on which attachment style you have, you're going to respond to these situations very differently. So let's go back now. Let's use my example of the miscarriage to kind of contextualize it. The securely attached person goes through my experience, and after the initial grieving says, that was extremely painful, but I trust that God has something better planned. There's no way God would have willed the death of an innocent child, so there must be something greater, and I will continue to trust him. And I don't actually feel that he's abandoned me, I just feel like I don't fully understand. And so they're able to heal from that in their spiritual life much faster. All right, the preoccupied style. Now we're dealing with the anxious styles. The preoccupied person prays for the life of their child, the child dies, and they immediately experience it as rejection. God has abandoned me. Now, these assessments that we make are so deeply ingrained in us. My view that people will abandon me is such a deeply rooted thing that I don't even realize I'm making that assumption. And this causes problems in the spiritual life because we know God doesn't abandon us, right? So we know the theologically correct response is God does not abandon us. God hears our prayers regardless of what the outcome looks like. But this is very deep gut level things that I'm talking about. So you may know that with your head, but if you have one of the anxious attachment styles, you may be telling yourself, God didn't abandon me, he didn't abandon me. But what you feel is this very profound sense of abandonment. If you have the preoccupied attachment, you're going to respond with a combination of very angry and very clingy behavior with God. So your prayer life would be like, God, why weren't you there for me? Why didn't you answer my prayers? Over and over, kind of ruminating on this pain that you can't get past because God has abandoned you. You feel a great deal of anger, but it's scary to express that anger at God. We know that that's wrong. We believe that it's sinful, whether it is sinful or not, we believe that it is. And so we struggle with this guilt then. I'm angry at God, but I shouldn't be, and I feel deep guilt about that. And guilt is especially dangerous in the spiritual life because, you know, in a human relationship, you can say, well, things have gone wrong between my spouse and I, but, you know, it's partly his fault, right? You know, it's not just me. It's partly my husband's fault. But in the spiritual life, we know it's our fault. So this guilt that the preoccupied attachment style can feel can be very intense and very scary. All right, the fearful attachment. Remember, we said the fearfully attached person has the same level of anxiety about being rejected, but they deal with it by slamming the door on their feelings. So, your baby dies. You have the fearful attachment style. You feel that God has abandoned you, as I did. This was my experience. God has abandoned you. And that leads to this cascade of really painful emotions. But it's too painful. I can't deal with it. So I slam the door to my emotions in my prayer life. So what do? I come to God and I say my prayers and I go to Mass and I say my rosaries because I have this sense of duty. This is the right thing to do. But there's no emotional content to it. I have emotionally distanced myself from God. Now, the fearfully attached person probably does this anyway in their spiritual life because they're uncomfortable with too much emotional vulnerability. This attachment style probably isn't very emotional in their prayer life to begin with. But now they're actively trying to squash down very powerful emotions. They'll probably experience a greater and greater emotional separation from God. Because if I feel anything about God, I'm going to feel all this pain and I can't feel that. Well, you feel spiritual dryness, you assume that that is a way that you're being tested. So now the fearfully attached person says, okay, not only did God not answer my prayers for my baby's life, now he's also deliberately removing all sense that I had of his comfort and consolation. I feel doubly abandoned because I don't realize how I'm contributing to that process. And it is dangerous because I think both the preoccupied and the fearful, but maybe most especially the fearfully attached type, are most at risk for just walking away from the faith. Not because they don't believe in God, but because the pain is too great and God feels too distant, and I just feel abandonment, and I'm gonna walk away. So we have this expression in therapy, and especially in couples therapy, relationship therapy, that it's never about what it's about. Couples will come into therapy and they have the same argument over and over and over again. He never takes out the garbage. She is always nagging me, whatever it is. But in therapy, what you see is that they're talking about these things that seem kind of small. They're not things you divorce over, but there is so much painful emotion underneath them. Why is that? Because it's not really about the dishwasher, right? It's all the years of feeling that I'm being taken for granted, right? There's layers to it. If as a therapist, I don't help the couple to see, it's not the dishwasher, it's feeling like they don't see you, they don't care about you. If I don't address that deeper pain, I can't help them do any better in their relationship, right? And that's true in our spiritual life as well. If we can't work through these ruptures in our relationship with God openly and honestly with the help of ideally a psychologically sensitive spiritual director and a good therapist, then we can't advance, we can't get through it in the spiritual life. The good news is you actually can work through these things. So when I hear people talking about the struggles that they have in their spiritual life, the first thing I always say is, go talk to a therapist. See what is going on that you might be able to fix. What woundedness do you have that's contributing to this? And I say this to priests as well. A priest's job is to accompany souls. You can't hear somebody say, God has abandoned me, and immediately respond, oh no, they didn't. Don't think that, that's wrong. Well, they know it's wrong. They just can't feel that it's wrong. So priests need to have this kind of psychological awareness of what aspects of the person's woundedness, their experiences, their memories, their fears are bound up so intimately in their spiritual life that it's affecting their relationship with God. But I want to end on a note of hope. I've delved into struggle and suffering, but the great news is that you can work through these things just as you can work through those difficulties in your human relationships. And you can move to a greater security. You may have an anxious attachment style. You can move towards greater security by beginning to see how you react out of fear, and then choosing to step back and act contrary to that fear, so that you can allow yourself to have more of these supportive, loving experiences that can gradually move you towards greater confidence in your own lovability. So I would just want to close with that. Hopefully there's a little something in there that might be of interest to you, maybe something you can see how it's relevant in your own lives. And again, bring your humanity into your spiritual life. I'll end with that. And then I'm happy to take any questions, unpack any of this more, whatever you'd like to talk about.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Muñoz, for sharing your insights with us. And we have a few questions here, so we'll do a few of them now. If anybody else has questions you've thought of, feel free to type them in the chat window and we'll get to your questions in sequence here. First up, we have Tricia, who has a question about psychological awareness, and I'll let her ask that question herself.
Okay. I gotta find my question. Sorry. But in general, I think I was asking about how can we help somebody develop a deeper psychological awareness of maybe some of the issues in the mission field. I work with people sometimes dealing with blind spots, past trauma and all that. And what are some ways that we can gently work with people to open them up to, especially because I work in areas where there aren't a lot of professionally trained psychologists available. So in Asia, more even trauma. Yeah, it makes it really more interesting. So what are some ways that we can really help lead them to, deeper understanding of themselves and ultimately a greater intimacy with God and behavior towards others?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm pausing because I'm trying to think of a good answer. I think people are hungry for insights into their suffering. So if, just take it for instance, if a priest is working with somebody in confession who says, I think God has abandoned me, instead of responding, well, God hasn't abandoned you and you just need to think about that. If he himself has the sensitivity to say, I think what's happening is that you don't really believe God loves you. That is enough to sort of wake the person up to, there actually are other things going on. I would never have thought of that, but now that you mention it, yeah, I don't think God loves me. So how do you do it in general? I'm not sure, outside of individual conversations where you might be able to make a little connection for them. But that presumes that you have the type of relationship with them where you could do that and it wouldn't be presumptuous and nosy and so on. I think maybe a good place to start for somebody in your situation might be to grab a copy of the book, The Temperament God Gave You. It's simple, it's easy to read, it's not overly theoretical, it's immediately applicable to people. They'll see themselves in one of the 4 attachment styles. And I think that might be attachment styles, one of the 4 temperaments. And that might just be a good window into beginning to think about those different aspects of themselves. Does that help?
Yeah, I think, and then, later on I'd be interested in just hearing more about what kind of practical approaches non-professionals can use towards people. I've recognized somebody in every quadrant of attachment style as well, so how to help them in their relationship with Christ and themselves and others. But I'll let other people talk first, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, we might get back to you, Tricia, but we have a few other questions here. Next, I would like to introduce Christina O'Brien. She's one of our young adults here at St. Dominic's in LA, and she has a great question about the different attachment styles and the quadrants of them. So go ahead, Christina.
Hi, thank you for your time.
Sure.
I'm wondering about where a person who has a negative view of themselves but then fears hurting and abandoning others would fit into the attachment style. So somebody who thinks that they're lovable but maybe doesn't think they're capable of the same type of love. So like preoccupied with this narrative of you love me too much and I'm bound to hurt you, with maybe is reminiscent of relationship OCD, if that's something that you know, what you've studied.
I haven't, that's the first time I've heard the expression relationship OCD. Can you tell me more what you mean by that?
I guess from what I've read about it, from what I've been told about it, kind of this sense that, or invasive thoughts about the relationship that sort of being preoccupied pretty much with this feeling that like this is the wrong relationship, but with no sort of grounding for that.
Okay, so it's very heightened anxiety in your relationships. You're sort of constantly worrying about the quality of the relationship, where it's going, how the other person sees you.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like the preoccupied attachment style. Again, with the caveat that the fearful style feels those same anxieties, but tries not to look at them. So a lot of the time isn't aware of those, but they will often pop up and have that kind of obsessive quality to them. So yeah, that would be one of the two anxious styles. Did you have a further question about?
I guess if there's any insight or study into that sort of reversal of preoccupied. I guess when I read about attachment styles last time, I also saw this sort of emphasis on the other person's going to abandon me. But what about those people who have this sense that they're going to be the one who does the hurting, and so fears relationships?
Yeah, I think that would be part and parcel. It all goes back to the anxiety that I am somehow fundamentally flawed.
Right.
So you have this sort of obsessive focus on your own weakness and your own tendency to just mess things up. So whether it's you finding out about that and rejecting me, or me hurting you through my just all the ways that I am frustrated with myself, I do think that would be part and parcel. I haven't read anything that talks about that specifically.
No, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question, Christina. We'll see if we have time to get to your second question here. But first, I want to introduce Aloni. She has a question about anger and the role anger plays in the spiritual life. So I'll ask her to ask her question of you. Hello.
Hi. I just wanted to, I liked how you brought up the emotions. And I think a lot of the times, as you mentioned, when we feel like angry at God or abandoned by God, just the role of emotions and paying attention to that in our spirit, it can help. But specifically, can you speak to anger and how, because that is an emotion I think that gets downplayed a lot in the spiritual, in our faith, that like, well, I've been taught, and I've been trying to like get to, that anger is an evil spirit, and really, it is in a sense when it takes over, right? And it dictates what your behavior is. But how, in any way, can the role of emotions or anger specifically can positively, benefit your spiritual life or connection with God or others? Because sometimes it's coming from a place of love, that anger sometimes. So anyway.
Yeah, anger is a scary emotion, isn't it? I think most of us feel like emotion is emotion and it's either good or bad, but we don't always feel that way about anger, because anger is kind of scary. And like I was saying, anger feels sinful when it's directed at God. Anger, St. Thomas says anger is a response to an evil. So something happens in your life that's painful, or somebody treats you unjustly. There's some kind of evil present. And anger is the response that you have to do something about it, to fix it. So anger gives you that sort of like a jolt of energy to deal with the situation, as opposed to sadness. Sadness is response to an evil, but you don't think you can do anything. So your response is a sort of passive sadness. So anger is a good thing. As you said, though, properly understood, and it can get out of hand. Another difficulty with anger is that it often is masking something deeper. Anger often hides anxiety or sadness. And so when you get to the point that you're describing where anger is a problem, it doesn't subside. You know, you're supposed to see the evil, deal with it, and then the anger goes away. But when anger gets stuck and you can't get out of it, there's something going on underneath the surface that probably isn't anger. It's probably anxiety or hurt. And so then looking at what's causing that and trying to address that will help the anger to dissipate. Does that answer what you were asking about?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question, Aloni. And now we have a question from one of our parishioners here at St. Dominic's, Victor Ibarra, a question about the attachment styles. So feel free to ask your question, Victor.
Well, it was me, Cheryl, who asked the question. Is there a way to change your attachment style, or can it be changed, or do you want to change it?
Yeah. Yes and no. So, like most things, yes and no. We do know that your attachment style begins in infancy and it continues throughout your life. Yeah. So, that being said, you can change it, but it requires very conscious work. So, let's say I had very critical parents, and so I grew up thinking that people will always reject me. But then I managed to find a really wonderful spouse, and all the information they're giving me, is that I'm lovable, I'm worthwhile. To the extent that I can sort of get out of my head, get out of this expectation that I'm not lovable, people will reject me, and actually step back and take a look at your husband and say, oh, but he does love me, and really see that, then yes, you can begin to lose some of that anxiety about your relationships. One of the reasons why attachment styles tend to be so enduring, though, is that it's hard to do that. It's hard to step back and see more than what you're used to focusing on. We tend to focus only on the feedback we get that supports what we already think, right?
Yeah.
So I think people reject me, I see it everywhere. But maybe I'm not seeing all the places where people aren't rejecting me. So that's where a good counselor can also help kind of stretch what you're seeing and allow you to kind of open yourself up to more security.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you for your question. And now we have one more question from Yvette Richardson, another one of our parishioners here at St. Dominic's Church. And she has a question about our over-spiritualizing our relationship and what we can do with that. So I'll have her ask her question.
Hi. So you stated that you have an you can be over spiritualized and with the relationship with God, which means to me that you wouldn't be aware if you had that problem. Okay. So what key factors or what would you look for to help a person understand that they have for the difference in their emotion to go and talk to a therapist, that type of thing?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, I think clinically, when we see a particular behavior in somebody, a parent will come in and say, you know, I'm concerned about my son. He's doing X, Y, and Z behaviors. Is that a problem? We say, well, it's only a problem if it's a problem. You know, if it's causing you suffering, if it's affecting your life in a negative way, then it's a problem. And so maybe that's the starting point when you're wondering, gosh, am I doing this in my relationships? Well, there's that old poster that says, remember, the only common link in all your dysfunctional relationships is you. Sort of, but you know, if you're able to step back and say, wait a minute, all of these relationships, I struggled in the same way. Maybe there is something going on that I need to look at. And this goes back to the question the First Lady asked, you know, how do you help people develop that awareness? Well, I don't know how to give a global answer to that, except maybe just starting with, is it causing you suffering? Are you unhappy in your relationships? Do you feel like you have this weird pattern where things start out great and then they go off the rails? If that's true, then, you know, start looking around at what else might be going on.
Thank you very much.
Okay, for our final question, I think we'll go back to Tricia again. She has a question just asking for a book recommendation, a good resource we can turn to dive deeper into some of the ideas you've asked about here, but I'll have Tricia ask more particularly what she was asking for.
Yeah, you gave us a great resource on learning more about the 4 temperaments, but what about helping people with attachment theory?
I was kind of afraid you were going to ask me that. I was like, that's a good answer I can give to that question. Unfortunately, most of what I'm familiar with attachment theory is the scholarly literature, which is, it's not the most helpful. But honestly, there are textbooks, that type of a resource where they have an entry on attachment theory. And it's, it's maybe not too long and it maybe not too heavy. The kind of level of like a college psychology 101 class will give a nice overview of attachment theory. I wish I could say, oh, there's this book for a popular audience.
What about an academic one?
So Bowlby wrote 3 books on attachment theory, and I found them surprisingly readable, actually. I read them all for my dissertation. If you have access to a university library and you can do article searches, if you type in attachment and anything, you will get more hits than you know what to do with. Probably even starting a Google search online, even without scholarly access, will give you something. But I feel dissatisfied with that answer to your question. I feel like surely there is something I can give you. So maybe if Brother John, is there a way that she can give you her email address and then I can get that? I can maybe email you if something comes to mind that will be helpful.
Yeah, sure. I can connect both of you by email. That's possible.
Let's do that.
Okay, excellent. So thank you everybody for coming to our Science and Faith talk, our first one via Zoom. I think it was a great success. It worked well with the questions and answer, and we had a great presentation from Dr. Jennifer Muñoz. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with how busy your life is out on the East Coast, trying to homeschool 3 children. And anyway, it was great to see you all. God bless, and I will see you again in 4 weeks. Hopefully, our final presenter for our Science and Faith series is Dr. Joseph Zapata, and he's one of the country's experts on the whole Galileo imbroglio that the church got sucked into. So he's read the history, he's been published many different places about this whole situation. So if you've ever had any questions or any questions about the whole Galileo situation, Dr. Zapata will be able to answer them very, very clearly for you. So I hope to see you again May 31st. We'll send out another invite, so just keep your eyes peeled for that. And God bless, stay safe and healthy and holy, and we'll see you again.
Thank you very much.